What has become of the People's Republic of China today started more than half a century ago. On October 1, 1949, the leader of the Communist Party, Mao Zedong, proclaimed the establishment of the PRC. The historical regime switch from the US-backed nationalists to Mao's communists had substantial consequences on the relationship between the US and China for several decades to come. The fall of China was widely considered as a catastrophe in the US. It led to a divisive debate on who was responsible for the loss of China to communism. President Truman was blamed for his incompetent foreign policy that had aided the collapse of China. Many American foreign affairs officers became the victims of McCarthyism, a radical campaign against alleged communists in the US government and other institutions. Today, arguing on who lost China to communism is no longer relevant. However, a retrospect to the US diplomacy to China still rings a bell to the US leaders in dealing with today's communist China. About 80 years ago, the US-China alliance was far different from what we see today. Then, the Republic of China was positive in civil discourse in the US. The leader of the nationalist government, Chiang Kai-shek, was praised by the US President Roosevelt as a friend and ally. Since the beginning of World War II, China had received diplomatic and financial support from the US to oppose the Japanese invasion of China. After the Pearl Harbor bombing in December 1941, the US declared war on Japan, and its political and military ties with China were further strengthened. The Chinese Communist Party was founded in 1921 and quickly became the rival to the Nationalist Party. The two major parties decided to form the First United Front to end warlordism, but later became against each other due to each party's different aims. In 1927, Chiang started to purge the communists from the front, initializing the long battle between the two parties. The communist leaders and troops were eventually forced to make the Long March to Yan'an, a remote area in the north of China, which gave the communists the necessary isolation to recuperate and rebuild their army. The Long March solidified Mao's status as the undisputed leader of the Communist Party. The battle of the two parties was paused by the outbreak of the Japanese invasion of China in 1937. The Nationalists and the Communists once again decided to form the Second United Front to fight against Japan. However, the alliance was only in the name. With the US's continuous support, the nationalist military confronted the Japanese in the major battlefields, whilst the Communists, joined with its 8-round army, took the opportunity to carve out independent bases of operations with their guerrilla war tactics. In the middle of the Sino-Japanese War, Chiang became more and more suspicious of the threats from Mao's expanding forces. As clashes intensified, both the US and Soviet Union attempted to solve the conflicts. President Roosevelt had sent several envoys to talk with Chiang and his party leaders to express concerns about the hostility between the two parties. The United States Army Observation Group, commonly known as the Dixie Mission, was the first U.S. effort to establish official relations with the Communist Party of China, at the time headquartered in Yan'an. The mission was launched on July 22, 1944, and packed up on March 11, 1947. In addition to establishing a connection, the mission was also set to investigate the Communists and determine if the U.S. would benefit from establishing an alliance. John S. Service of the U.S. Department of State was responsible for the political analysis, and Colonel David D. Barrett of the U.S. Army performed the military analysis. After arriving in Yan'an, Service sent a series of reports to the U.S. Embassy in Chongqing that sparked controversy immediately. He credited the Communists for a clear and superior society, in contrast to the corruption and chaos that he saw in Chiang's governing territory. Later, Service advocated that the U.S. should work with the forces opposed to the nationalists, such as the Communists. At the same time, Colonel David Barrett evaluated the Communist military potential by observing war games between Communist troops and visiting war schools set up to train Chinese officer corps. Barrett felt that the Communists emphasized indoctrinating their soldiers over military training, but he believed that American advisors could train the Communist soldiers to become excellent fighters. On November 7, 1944, General Patrick Hurley, then the acting ambassador to China, visited Yan'an with the aim of uniting two parties in a unified government. However, Hurley had no knowledge of either party in their battles. He believed that the difference between the Communists and Nationalists was no greater than the Democrats and Republicans in the United States. Hurley's view on the future of China was disputed by people instrumental in the Dixie Mission. John Paton Davies Jr. was one of such China hands. Davies believed that the coalition was impossible to form, and Chiang's regime would ultimately be a dead end for American policy in China. As time progressed, Davies also saw the communists as the realistic alternative to the nationalists to govern China. The first post-war negotiation was held in Chongqing from August 28 to October 10 in 1945, which was the last time Chiang and Mao were seen together. The Double Tenth Agreement was signed with both parties stressing the importance of a peaceful reconstruction. After Roosevelt's death in office, Vice President Truman took the assumed presidency. Suddenly, those wartime problems became Truman's to solve. He sent his favorite general George Marshall to China with the attempts to negotiate a ceasefire and form a unified government. Marshall would spend the following 13 months attempting to prevent the resumption of the Chinese Civil War. Just a few weeks after Marshall arrived in China, the two parties agreed to a ceasefire under Marshall's guidelines. Both parties settled on the principles of a democratic government, listening to Marshall's readings of Benjamin Franklin's speeches and explaining the Bill of Rights. However, the agreement wasn't sustainable and inevitably gave way to irreconcilable differences about China's destiny. Mao was seen as dishonest since he was unwilling to abandon his communist ideology and ambition. Chiang seemed to use the mutual talks as a way to reduce international pressure from his party, as well as a stalling tactic to assist his primary goal of eliminating the communists. After World War II, the Soviet Army helped Mao's military to take over the northeastern regions of China from Japan. Chiang desperately sent the troops to prevent the communists from expanding their bases. On June 26, 1946, full-scale war between the two parties eventually broke out. China then entered a state of civil war that would last for more than 3 years. Marshall struggled for the following months to avert a breakdown, only at the end to convince President Truman that the nationalists would never win on their own, and the U.S. intervention to stop the communists would only weaken U.S. opposition to the Soviet Union. General Albert Wedemeyer was the last U.S. representative sent for a fact-finding mission. As Wedemeyer reported, U.S. interests were best served by continuing support for the nationalist government. However, Truman suppressed the report and refused to expand aid to the nationalist government to avoid being involved in the Chinese Civil War. After Wedemeyer's visit, the U.S. packed up operations in Yan'an. The two-decade struggle between the nationalists and communists came to an end in 1949, with the communist victory in establishing the People's Republic of China in the mainland and the U.S.-backed nationalist government and thousands of its troops driven to Taiwan, an island off the southeast coast of the Fujian province. After 1949, the U.S. continued supporting the exiled nationalist government in Taipei, setting the stage of several decades of limited U.S. relations with mainland China. While mainland China, under Mao's leadership, became the enemy, a communist nation affiliated with the Soviet Union. Truman refused to recognize Communist China as a legitimate government. He wrote, "As long as I am president, if I can prevent it, that cutthroat organization will never be recognized by us as the government of China." In July 1971, Henry Kissinger made a secret trip to mainland China. In February 1972, U.S. President Richard Nixon became the first president to visit mainland China since 1949. He met Chairman Mao of the Communist Party and signed the Shanghai Communique to lead the normalization of relations between the U.S. and China for the years to come. Over several decades, who lost China, questions raised and issues debated, reflect on an American foreign policy and politics rather than the Chinese reality. When facing Chinese domestic conflict with little knowledge of its culture and history, the U.S. diplomacy to China was likewise a disappointment to any side involved. At the crucial time between two opposed Chinese parties on who was going to win the country and Chinese people eventually, the U.S. unfortunately chose to back up the losing side. As American historian David Oshinsky said in his book, A Conspiracy So Immense, the United States has never at any time been in a position to exercise more than a minor influence on China's destiny. China was lost by the Chinese.